This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Welcome again to another episode of Preservation Conversations. Happy May 20th. May, just like April, seems to be flying by, but it's hard to believe it's already going to be Memorial Day weekend this weekend. But thank you again for taking some time to join us and have another conversation regarding preservation. And we have some very special guests with us today. Today's theme is who are they and why do I need them? With special guests Maureen Cavanaugh and Holly Herbster from the Public Archaeology Lab, otherwise known as PAL. Preservation, well, I'll get to that in just a minute. But just kind of reminding everybody as you join us, please mute your phones. Just helps cut down on all the background noise. And also, because this is going to be recorded and posted to our website and YouTube, it just makes it a little bit easier to hear. If you have any questions, and we hope there'll be a lot of questions because we have two fantastic special guests with us today, you can send them via the chat feature, which is a little conversation bubble in your GoToMeeting toolbar. And we're going to, you can send them throughout the hour, and then we're going to answer them at the end of the conversation. And if for some reason we're not able to get to your question, by the time we end, I'll save the chat log and we'll try to reach out and make sure that we get the answer you were looking for back to you. And also know that we have, if the question doesn't specifically relate to the topic today, we welcome any and all questions. So again, this is the 8th episode that we're going to be working on. This is just a way to positively connect, communicate, and share ideas, questions, thoughts among the preservation community, and hopefully learn something. So if you have any thoughts about future topics you'd like to talk about, presenters you'd like to have us bring on, like Maureen and Holly today, I'll have my email on a slide at the end of the conversation, so please feel free to let me know what you think. So as I said, we're really excited today to have on with us Maureen Cavanaugh, Senior Planner, and Holly Herbster, Senior Archaeologist and Proposal Coordinator from the Public Archaeology Lab. Maureen is, I will say, Maureen is a member of the Preservation Massachusetts Board of Directors, and she's absolutely fantastic. And I was so delighted when she agreed to be part of our conversations. And then when she asked us if we wouldn't mind having Holly on as well, I thought that was really great to have some input from an archaeologist as well. So I'm going to turn it over to them in just a few minutes, but we're so excited for them to talk about preservation, consultation, the role that they as consultants and their firm plays in working with communities, organizations, the preservation world as a whole. It's probably one of the single thing I refer the most when we get lots of calls. We're telling a lot of people you really need to talk to a preservation consultant because they can give you much better information, and their role is absolutely critical. At least from Preservation Massachusetts perspective, they are such an important partner, and we're so glad to have them give us a little insight as to how they work. So also on today, we have the Preservation Massachusetts staff as always, and also Chris Kelly from the Massachusetts Historical Commission. So with that, I will turn it over to Maureen and Holly. So I will turn it over to them. So Maureen and Holly, whenever you need the slides advanced, just let me know and I'll take care of that. So thank you so much for being with us.
All right. Thank you, Erin, and thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, hello? We can hear you fine. Yep, we can hear you fine.
Great. So Holly and I work together at the Public Archaeology Laboratory in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. I'll introduce myself and Holly can introduce herself, and then we'll tell you a little bit about PAL and then give you some just examples of the projects we're working on. And we aren't going to dive deep into any of those projects, but if there's something that catches your fancy and you have questions about, we can answer them in the Q&A. So I am a senior planner. My background's in architectural history and urban planning. And in my early career, I worked at Mass Historical Commission for 7 years, working on the same sorts of projects we're going to be presenting today. And I've been a historic preservation consultant for the last 20 plus years, working in sort of environmental permitting and in historic tax credits. So Holly, if you want to give them.
Sure. Yeah. Everyone can hear me too, correct?
Yep.
Okay, great. So thanks again for inviting me. I'm very happy to be participating. I have been with Public Archaeology Lab for just about 30 years now. My background is, as with most professional archaeologists, anthropology as an undergraduate background, and then a master's degree at UMass Boston in historical archaeology and history. I have worked in various roles at PAL. Now I am one of the senior archaeologists, meaning I direct projects. I do get to go out in the field once in a while, but primarily responsible for oversight and working with clients directly to set up different types of projects and provide services as they relate to not just archaeological excavation, but also research, consultation and coordination with partners that include Native Americans, local communities, and other interested parties. And I'll let you go, Maureen.
Okay, so next slide. So this sort of summarizes the areas that we work in. As Holly said, and I said, we work in archaeology, architectural history, and historic preservation planning. And we work for a variety of client types. We work for state, federal, and municipal governments, lots of utilities, transmission lines, wind power. We work for private developers. So, and we work on really small projects and really large projects, and we have some examples of those in the projects we're going to show to you. And so this list just sort of summarizes the things we work on. We do a lot of, well, as Holly said, archaeological investigation, but historic architectural survey and archaeological survey. Preservation planning, we work on preservation plans. We're doing one right now for the city of Boston for all of their schools. We do a lot of work under state and federal requirements. Section 106 is the federal, and within the state it's Chapter 254. And we work with many states, but are focused on New England. Historic or National Register nominations, we'll show you some we're working on. Historic tax credit projects. We work on 106 again. We do archival documentation, historic American building survey, engineering record, and landscape survey. And we also do archival large format photography. And we have a full lab, which Holly will tell you a little bit more about. And then another area that we do a lot of work in is doing interpretive exhibits, publications, historic signage in parks, or we've got some examples in what we have to show you. So I'll turn it over to Holly. Next slide.
Great. Yes, and also I'll just add that we are incorporated as a not-for-profit, and so we do have an educational mandate and component. So a lot of the work that we do involves either presenting project information or general information to the public, hosting different types of events. Whenever we can, we like to incorporate historic preservation in community outreach for all ages. So we have traveling exhibits that we take into schools. We do public talks and lectures when we're invited by community groups, historical societies, things of that sort. So that's also, we like to be a resource for the community for that type of work as well. Just a little quick background about PAL. We were incorporated in 1982, originally part of Brown University. So the original Public Archaeology Lab was part of Brown University's anthropology department. The archaeologists there did the first projects that were part of PAL. And one of the earliest things that we did was we were contracted, PAL as part of Brown University was contracted by the Mass DOT to do the original archaeological survey along the Route 495 corridor extension. So the entire route east of Route 95. That was one of the earliest PAL projects and probably one of the earliest cultural resource management large-scale infrastructure projects that was done in New England. And it resulted in the identification of a lot of really significant archaeological sites, actually. So when you drive down that corridor, you can kind of picture that was a big archaeological area. We have been located in Pawtucket throughout that entire time. We're in our current home, which is on the slide here. The historic Tokelon Club was built in 1911. When we took it over, the club had pretty much lost most of its membership. As you can imagine, men's clubs are not the fashion these days. And we actually used federal tax credits to help with the rehabilitation of the building. And now we have this beautiful office in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. We've been there since 2012. And since our incorporation in 1982, we have completed more than 3,000 projects. So we are definitely the largest cultural resource management firm in New England. We work primarily in New England for archaeology. We're limited to the Northeast region for the most part because that's the area of our expertise. Our architectural historians can work pretty much nationwide, so we do occasionally have projects that take us farther away. We've done some work in Puerto Rico. We've done a couple of projects in the Bahamas. But primarily the bread and butter of what we do is in the northeastern states. And next slide.
So the next two slides just talk about sort of the real tasks that we do within the sort of categories that we're going to be talking about. As outlined in section 106 is we identify and evaluate historic cultural resources and document them. And so we use that throughout for anything we're working on, whether it be an archaeological survey or a National Register nomination or a historic tax credit project. And we're out in the field all the time, and actually even now we're out in the field, but distanced. So this just shows some photos of things we do. Obviously, research is a big part of it. Getting out and doing measurements, doing archival large format photography, getting out in the field, and it's definitely the most fun part of what we do. And then we evaluate properties. We evaluate properties for if they're historic, with a big H, so if they meet the National Register criteria of eligibility, and we do that with townwide surveys, again, and our nominations, archaeological surveys, and for those that, and we make recommendations for National Register eligibility, and then that information can be used for preservation planning purposes for a municipality or an institution, or it can be used for assessing project effects for projects that have the potential to impact these properties. So, yeah, Holly, do you want to say anything more about that?
We can go on to the next slide, I think, and then I can add to that. So as Maureen mentioned, we do sort of all different types of tasks. We do research, we do field work. We also do in-house all of our processing of artifacts and materials that come in through archaeological surveys. So we have a full service lab in our building in the basement, and we also serve as an approved curation facility. So we hold not only collections that have come in through PAL projects, but we're also the designated repository for a number of state and federal agencies. So we meet the curation standards and guidelines that include things like climate control, secure storage. Everything is in acid-free paper boxes. We have a catalog system that allows us to go in and pull out any given artifact from any project that we've worked on. So that's a really important part of what we do too. I'll also mention that for archaeological projects in Massachusetts, as in most states, work has to be completed under a state archaeologist permit that gets issued by the Mass Historical Commission. So we cannot put a shovel in the ground anywhere in Massachusetts, private property, state or federal owned property. It doesn't matter where we are. We need to have a permit from the state archaeologist. If we're working on federal land, we typically also need to work under what's known as an Archaeological Resources Protection Act, or ARPA permit. But in Massachusetts, we typically always consult with the Mass Historical Commission, even on projects that involve federal land. So the important thing about the permitting process is that it requires us to submit a detailed methodology and work plan for anything that we're doing. We have to follow certain professional standards for how we do our field work, how we do our lab processing, and we have to produce a technical report when the project's completed that details the results of all that work. And all of those, at all of those stages, we're involved in consultation with the Mass Historical Commission. You want to add anything, Maureen, about survey?
No, I think you covered it well.
Okay.
All right, so next slide.
Next.
So now we're going to present, that's good. Yeah, this is good. Just the types of projects we work on. So this section is called Survey and Identification. So PAL works on a lot of community-wide historic property surveys, often, most typically, with funding through the Massachusetts Preservation Projects Fund through Mass Historical Commission. Some municipalities will fund them on their own. We also have done surveys for institutions. Northeastern University as an example, MIT, and sometimes for state agencies. But so Clinton is an example of one of the towns we've worked on, but we're working in several towns right now, and often they're multi-phases over many years. And the municipalities will use this information for preservation planning within their town, for making National Register recommendations. It's a great planning tool, and it's great that MHC helps to fund them, because otherwise not as many would be getting done. So you go to the next slide.
So following up on what Maureen just talked about, in addition to doing those sort of project-specific development-related archaeological survey projects, we also work on similar community-wide comprehensive surveys for towns in Massachusetts, and they are referred to as archaeological reconnaissance surveys. To date, about 20 of the towns in Massachusetts or municipalities have completed these projects. PAL's been involved in about 10 of them. We're currently working on a community-wide reconnaissance survey in North Attleboro, and Susan Taylor, who's the chair of the North Attleboro Historical Commission, is on the line today. So this is a shout out to that project. Most of the projects use, as Maureen mentioned, matching grants from the Survey and Planning Grant, MHC Survey and Planning Grant program, which is fantastic. For these types of projects, there is absolutely no digging involved. So despite the fact that you see this headline that says they dig it here for North Attleboro, we don't do any kind of ground disturbance as part of these surveys. Instead, we do a lot of local research. We spend a lot of time in the community working with the local historical commission, a lot of meetings and coordination with different town offices, so town planners, conservation commissions, zoning boards. It's a great opportunity to network with members of the community. We also always hold, as part of these projects, a public or community archaeology day where we invite members of the community to come out. If people have artifacts or information that they want to share, they bring it in and we record that information. The outcome of these projects is to produce comprehensive, generalized archaeological sensitivity maps for the town, which can then be used combined with recommendations that we make for ways to incorporate local project review. So in other words, projects that may fall through the cracks or that don't have any kind of federal or state permitting or funding, so may not go to Mass Historical Commission for review, but to really empower communities to understand the most important cultural areas in their communities, and then help to develop local regulations or at least planning tools that can help to preserve those resources. Next.
Thanks. Actually, I want to stand corrected. It's not the MPPF program. It is the Survey and Planning Program. The MPPF is for small, sort of real property improvements. And then this, PAL does a lot of work on landscapes, vernacular as well as planned landscapes. We worked on lots of projects with DCR, and when we do surveys and National Register nominations, landscape is always a component of it, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller. So the next one is National Register nominations. We do, if you can change the slide, and then you can go on to the next one. We work on lots of National Register nominations for a variety of reasons. Some are honorary, cities and towns. We work a lot on nominating cemeteries, municipal buildings. A lot of the work we do is to support projects seeking historic tax credits. So I was just, the next few slides, again, I won't go into a lot of detail about them and how we work either, but it's just to give you an idea of sort of the breadth of the types of properties we work on. This is the Carter School if you go back one, the Carter School in Fitchburg. This is a tax credit project. It is 99% finished, waiting for the original front doors to come back from being restored. And this, sat empty for now almost 30 years, and people are starting to move in, and so that's actually with the Mass Historical Commission right now. So the next slide.
So we also do National Register nominations for archaeological sites or resources that do not have an above ground element, which is certainly not the majority of the National Register nominations we do. But this example is in Dartmouth. The town of Dartmouth actually contracted with PAL to list the Russell Garrison in the National Register. The town acquired the property in 1950, and it is the location of one of Dartmouth's earliest settlers, was also associated with a couple of really well-documented events during King Philip's War. And even though the house itself was gone probably by the early 1700s, the location was remembered locally. And so over the intervening 300 plus years, it was never developed. So the slide that you're looking at is one little undeveloped area in a relatively settled subdivision. So the site was preserved. It was reconstructed in the 1950s, and PAL was able to successfully complete the National Register nomination under all 4 of the criteria categories for the National Register, which is pretty amazing at the local level. And the property was listed in 2018. So it was a real accomplishment that the town was really happy to be able to complete. Next slide.
We also work on sort of thematic nominations. A lot of districts will be, the downtown district, which has finite boundaries, but then there's thematic nominations. We did one in Fitchburg for the work of a particular architect. We did a really great, the mid-century modern houses of Cape Cod was a really interesting project, and I really shone a light on these this housing type that, as you know, sometimes the recent past is underappreciated. So this is one of the houses that is in the nomination in Wellfleet. Okay, next slide. Oh, and then we worked with it was then MDC and then DCR on their Parkway system, surveying all the parkways and coming up with again, sort of a multi-property submission. We surveyed 69 properties, 28 were nominated, and it's a National Register nomination, but it's also a great planning tool for DCR and for the municipalities that these roads run through. And it's really great documentation on what the roads look like now, what they had looked like. I use it all the time for projects that are sort of adjacent to the parkways. So that was a fun project to work on. Okay, next one. And then these are, we've been trying to focus mainly on Massachusetts, but the next 2 are just projects we've worked on that have been fun and interesting. So for Ellis Island, we do a lot of work for the National Park Service. We have a nationwide contract with them to do National Register nominations. So we did the National Register nomination for the immigration building for Ellis Island, the historic district, and it had above ground components, amazing architecture, and then it had an archaeological component that Holly can speak to.
So separately, we have worked on a number of archaeological projects again in the Northeast for the Park Service, primarily as part of infrastructure improvements, but also we've done archaeological overview and assessments for different park units, which is similar to the community-wide survey, where we do a lot of background research and a lot of collecting information. For Ellis Island in particular, we worked on a couple of projects related to repairing a seawall and then putting in some security fencing, perimeter security fencing. And as part of those really targeted archaeological efforts that were very much related to infrastructure development, we identified some very important archaeological elements that are not visible on the surface today, including a remnant greenhouse that was part of the work area on Ellis Island in the 1800s, and also part of Fort Gibson, which was a defense work on the island prior to its development as the immigration center. So again, lots of different types of resources and lots of different historic preservation efforts on these properties that we work on. Next.
And this is the final National Register nomination we're going to just present briefly, is that we're working on the Appalachian Trail from Maine to Georgia. It's a multi-year project where we've been working on segments of it. And the field crew, the architectural historians, go out and they hike portions of it. And we've been, in the end, it'll be a single National Register nomination, but we're doing segments of it. Right now we're working on Tennessee and, oh God, I forget which other state. So, but this has been another great project to work on.
And for archaeology, sorry.
Oh no, I should say it was a lot of landscape components, obviously, as well as social history.
Right. And for archaeology, we actually did a tremendous amount of records research. So using the State Historic Preservation Office files in all of the states that the AT goes through. And as a result of that, we were able to provide documentation for over 900 archaeological sites that are already known and recorded either along the trail itself or right within the corridor on the federal or state-owned properties that are associated with the AT. And the sites span at least 10,000 years of human activity in the area where the trail runs now. So they date back to ancient Native American land use and all the way up to basically archaeological deposits associated with the creation, the construction of the trail, and some of the earliest recreational facilities and huts and whatnot located along the trail. Next.
So these next few projects, we work on state and federal historic tax credit applications. As Holly was saying, our projects are focused on New England. Massachusetts has a state credit, so that's a very active program. But most of our projects are in New England. We have several in New York and Pennsylvania, and we have one in Denver, Colorado. But for the most part, we're focused here. And it's if you know the historic. It's for the historic tax credit program is for income producing properties, and these are just examples of properties that we've worked on that are eligible: schools, mills, apartments, commercial buildings, theaters, municipal buildings, warehouses. I think the ones people are most familiar with probably are mills and schools and downtown commercial buildings. So next slide. So I'm just going to go through a few of the projects we're working on. The B.F. Brown Middle School in Fitchburg. This is a school that's been vacant, obviously, by looking at it. And it's going to be rehabilitated along with the Academy Street School across the street from it and the Fitchburg City Stables behind it for artists' live-work studios. And this is located directly behind the Fitchburg Art Museum. And we're also working on the National Register nomination for the Academy Street Historic District, which includes the 3 properties. And it will also be mixed income housing. Next slide. The Worcester County Courthouse is an amazing building if you're familiar with it. And it has many components. The 1843 portion of the building, and then the 1898 portion, and then what we call modern addition from the 1950s that the MHC and Park Service found was contributing. And so that is, the developer originally was going to demolish the rear 1950s wing, but now that's been incorporated into it. And it's going to be mixed use with some commercial, 117 apartments of mixed income. And it's a phenomenal building, and so much of it's being preserved. The courtrooms in the 1843 portion are going to just be kept intact. But if you can imagine, the major spaces in the building will become community areas. There's jail cells that are going to be incorporated into units, or holding cells, not jail cells. But that's in construction right now. It's amazing, huge project. And then one more. This is the Bishop Allen Apartments in Cambridge near Central Square. It was 4 different buildings within the Norfolk Street Historic District, and all of the buildings were coated in artificial siding. Every piece of them was. And the nonprofit Justice Start, working with the Cambridge Historical Commission and CPC funds, peeled off all the layers and was able to, identify what had been under there, and then salvage some pieces, and others were, replicated. And so all 4 buildings, this is one of them, are just amazing before and after. And the kitty corner from the Cambridge Farmers Market, and just really this whole corner has changed because of these historic tax credits, and this project wouldn't have been possible without them. All right, so moving on. And the last thing we're going to talk about is projects we've worked on, where we've worked on sort of the identification of historic resources, evaluating them, and then the project move. It's a lot of them are infrastructure projects, and then we also assist in the mitigation. The South Coast Rail project is a huge project, and we've been working on it for, oh golly, I want to say over 10 years. And we've identified historic resources along the rail, above and below ground. We've evaluated what impacts the project's going to have, and then worked with the MBTA and Mass DOT on mitigation measures. And this is just a small piece of it, but this is the Old Colony Railroad Station in Northeastern that we did archival documentation on. Okay, next slide.
This is a project that we worked on with the Kingston Historical Commission. The town had proposed to develop a portion, 4 acres on a 42-acre parcel that they purchased to expand some recreational fields for town use. Based on the results of Kingston's townwide archaeological reconnaissance survey, this parcel, this 42-acre area, had been identified as an area of Native American archaeological sensitivity. So the town, through their historical commission, actually used CPA funds to contract PAL to do an archaeological survey prior to the development of the project. So the town actually did not have any regulatory requirements to do this, but they proactively decided to do the archaeological work because they knew that it was a sensitive area. The initial survey was done a couple of years before PAL got involved. When we came on board, a pretty significant Native American site had been identified, and so we had to do some additional evaluation and then data recovery, which is sort of considered to be the final stage of archaeological work for the project. It involved a lot of close coordination with the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead, Aquinnah, and their Cultural Resource Tribal Historic Preservation Office. We involved the public in the project, so we had a couple of days where members of the community were actually able to come out to the site and help work on some excavation and screening with us. In the end, this site turned out to be a really significant ceremonial site as well as a habitation site. And the town, in consultation with Mass Historical Commission and the tribe, decided in the end that they were going to place this 4-acre area where the fields were going to go into a permanent conservation restriction, and the rec fields were relocated elsewhere. So this is just a really good example of the community sort of taking charge and identifying what was important in terms of their cultural resources and their historic preservation, and kind of going through all the steps that you go through for archaeological work, involving the community, involving descendant communities and indigenous people in the project, and then making a decision in the end that this was a really important cultural asset for them and that they weren't going to destroy the site for the development of these fields. So kind of a great example of seeing a project through from beginning to end. Next.
So this project, the Greenbush line restoration, which PAL worked on for over 20 years, similar to the South Coast Rail, we worked on identifying above and below ground resources along the 18-mile corridor, and working with the MBTA and Mass DOT, evaluating what impact the project would have on significant resources. And then there was an extensive mitigation program, which included noise and vibration mitigation. This is a noise wall that you see in Hingham here in the larger photo. And then we prepared interpretive panels for the stations, which you can see. Here's a sample one in the upper right, which is a pretty typical mitigation measure for projects, so people can understand the history of the rail. In this case, it's the history of the rail in a town and the history of the areas in which each of these stations fall. Okay, our next and last slide.
So our last example project is one of our most exciting and certainly one of our most well-publicized projects we worked on. We were involved in the cultural resource component of relocating the Had Lighthouse on Martha's Vineyard. The lighthouse was in danger of falling into the ocean. It had already been moved twice by the time we began this project in 2014. And the project involved a lot of coordination with a lot of different federal, state, and local entities. So just a few of those were the U.S. Coast Guard, which has oversight since Had Light is an active aid to navigation, Coast Guard involvement there. We had to work closely again with the Gayhead Aquina tribe because the lighthouse is located on the Gayhead Cliffs, which are held in trust for the tribe by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the cliffs themselves are a national natural landmark. So the Gayhead Lighthouse is listed in the National Register. The project cost more than $3 million, not the archaeological or cultural resources part, but the overall move cost $3 million. And it was, the Gayhead Lighthouse was identified as one of the most endangered properties in the country before this move started. The Save the Gayhead Lighthouse Committee, which was primarily a local grassroots organization, raised the money to do this move. And so we were involved, PAL was involved in doing before and after photographic and building documentation for the structure itself. So the lighthouse that's there now was built in 1856. It's not the original structure, but the one that got moved was built in 1856. We also had to do archaeological work around the lighthouse before it was moved and along the path that had to be built for the lighthouse to be slid back. So we identified the remains of the original keeper's house. There were some ancient Native American deposits that were on the property as well. And sort of the highlight of the project was that we were able to be part of the NOVA documentation of moving the lighthouse, which was sort of a highlight for us, certainly, to be able to be involved in that. And this is just another example of a very large scale project that had a lot of components, a lot of consultation, and really a complicated project that resulted in some really great information about cultural resources that was made available to the public at the end of the project. And with that, I think we are done.
Yep.
You want to add anything else, Maureen, or just want to take questions if people have them?
All set. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maureen and Holly, thank you so much. I mean, we know what you do, but if anything, today's presentation kind of made it clear you're like preservation superheroes, Superman. You kind of you do it all. And I didn't realize that you guys were actually a collections repository. That was fascinating. But you're involved with so many different projects in so many different ways. I think it's really helpful because one of the things we've been talking about over the course of the past several weeks is, preservation is, collaborative, and you're working with different partners, and you're, whether you're working with different historic commissions, working with different town boards or different businesses or organizations, it's rarely just preservation. So the preservation piece fits into a larger context. And I think going through the different ways that your work individually and what PAL's role is, it's really multifaceted and can contribute so much to an understanding of, not just the historic site, but perhaps a town story or a region's story. And you're creating these really important tools that, like Maureen said, you refer to the study that the Parkway study for when you're working on adjacent projects is something to refer back to. So this was just fascinating. Thank you so very much. I thought this was so helpful. And we'll open it up for questions. And I don't see any just yet, which is really, we have two preservation consultants on the line, and they're here. So please, if you have questions, but I'll just start it off kind of with like a feeler question. So a lot of the attendees, we know they're local preservationists, whether they're representatives of local historic commissions or local historic societies. They're often volunteers in their community. Do you have any advice for them? I know sometimes when they call us with an advocacy question or advocacy issue, and Preservation Massachusetts roles will always, it's like, we're not your consultants, but we can refer you or give you a list of consulting firms that can actually help you. Are there any general, tips or advice that you would give to historic commissions who may be struggling with, not really sure? I know this is a very, very broad question, but any tips or general advice for historic commissions, on how to work with preservation consulting firms, or, why it's a good idea to contact a consulting firm and not try to, why it's a good idea to reach out to somebody like PAL?
Well, I can jump in. This is Holly, and just mention that certainly I would recommend taking full advantage of the Mass Historical Commission and the preservation planners and archaeologists there as a great first step, because they can provide certainly the guidance for what might be available in terms of not only funding, but if there's any type of regulatory review that a local community, whether it's a historical commission or just a private consultant, can utilize as part of project planning. And certainly we're always a resource. We're happy to take field calls from people who are just looking for information or a way to connect, even if they're not really looking for somebody to hire to do work, where we can certainly direct them to different types of resources.
Great.
And I have on a sort of parallel track, probably one of the best things that local historical commissions can do is to survey, work with Mass Historical to use the S&P grants and survey their cities and towns, because it gives such a great context for evaluating properties. I'm sure, from having worked at Mass Historical and been a consultant all the time, you get calls about property that hasn't been documented. No one really knows anything about it, but people are concerned it's going to be demolished. And just, but if you can turn to a survey and say, oh, we surveyed it, we evaluated it, it just gives it a little bit more cachet in getting people's attention.
Great, thank you. And we have some questions now. A question all the way from Los Angeles, actually. We're transcontinental right now. They'd like to know if PAL, if your firm has ever had a hard time describing what you do and conveying why your role is important. So do you find it challenging, and how would you just see, how do you convey the importance of the work that PAL does?
Well, I think we can both answer.
Sure.
I would say it depends on who we're talking to. Like in a group like this, we're preaching to the choir, and so people get it. But a lot of the work we do is with developers and private property owners, and they see the regulatory process just as something they have to get through. So they actually appreciate us also, but it's because we help them get past some of the gatekeepers. Yeah, I don't know that we have. Usually, when I tell people what I do, people think it's really cool, and it is actually. Just you can tell from the slides that we showed you, we work on great projects and have a lot of fun and learn so much. But even the naysayers, like when they, Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I should say, even the naysayers, when we do find things that are significant, it can change. Like when they found that. Oh God, Holly, you probably know more about the Viking ship or whatever, down along the waterfront in Boston. And initially, the contractors, they just wanted to blow right through it. And then they called PAL, and PAL came out and said, you should stop and document it. But then the construction workers were really into the history of it, and were just sort of amazed that they found this down in the muck. And then bizarrely, the company ended up making their boardroom table out of the wood from the boat, but that's that's mitigation. But
it wasn't quite that old. It was a 19th century ship, but still, I think the biggest.
They thought it was Viking.
Right. I think the biggest challenge that we hear about, certainly from the archaeological side of the house anyway, is the cost that's involved, whether it's a developer or it's a community that's struggling to preserve something. That can be an obstacle, and typically the way that we try and get through that is just to really highlight the fact that cultural resources are irreplaceable. So when a historic building comes down or is, altered beyond any form of recognition, or when an archaeological site is destroyed through development, that's it. It's gone. It can never be replaced. And just really trying to involve local community members, and as Maureen mentioned, to get developers sort of invested in the positive PR that can come from doing this type of work, even if it is required, to kind of push that positive outreach aspect to a project proponent has really been a helpful way to encourage projects along and to kind of keep everybody positive and really to focus on that.
Wonderful, thank you. It's that's I think the example in Boston is a great example. They just want to blow right through it, but there can be some positive PR that comes about as a result. But I think it's important to remember, Holly and Maureen, like you said, we're kind of preaching to the choir here. But once something is gone, it's gone. You can't replace it. And I know Chris Kelly has asked a couple of questions, but I am going to, Chris, I'll get to those. But one just came up from the town of Otis. The preservation project is much longer than we ever expected. Is there a way to create a timeline of what has to be done so we don't miss any timelines? Where they're working with Bonnie Parsons, a local preservation consultant who used to work for the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, and her help has been invaluable. So we all know preservation takes a really long time. Is there and we know each project is different, but any thoughts, Maureen or Holly, about some sort of timeline or kind of like a general overview that could possibly help historic commissions know, maybe like a roadmap or some sort of timeline as to what has to be done when, or one step and then one, just to kind of, so they know what they're looking at. Any thoughts or suggestions?
Yeah, certainly planning at the earliest possible stages for a project or a development or whatever the effort might be is our number one recommendation for archaeological work in particular, because we do have to go through that permitting process. There are built-in set timelines. So in other words, there are review windows that we can provide to either the town or the client about how long things will take, but it's it can be a months or years long process. And that is a point of frustration, I think, for some proponents. So typically, we just say to everyone, as soon as you have a potential project, a potential effort that you want to undertake, get in touch with a preservation consultant and ask them to walk you through the timeline based on what the tasks are that you either need to have done or want to have done.
Great, thank you very much.
I have nothing to add, so that's great.
Okay, thank you, Holly. Diane, I hope that was helpful. And I think, like Holly and Maureen have said, you know, reaching out to a preservation consulting firm just to get some general, reaching out to somebody like Pal just to talk about a project, or, you know, just to get some thoughts. I mean, they are a firm and they, you know, they are a business, but I found more oftentimes than not, you know, I'll shoot Maureen questions, be like, what would you say about this? Or could you talk to this person? And more oftentimes than not, they're really, they're willing to share their expertise. Oh, we got more things coming up. Okay, so Diane Gilbert from Dartmouth. Many times we can be surprised with important archaeological finds, which gets folks into emergency mode, which everybody wants to avoid, a reality. Is that, Diane, I guess, I'm not really sure if that's a question, but is that kind of looking for, you know, how should communities react if they're actually working on a site and all of a sudden they do happen to find archaeological evidence? Not really sure.
Yeah, I could just mention that, you know, going back again to that sort of broad community level survey that Maureen and I both talked about. Towns in particular, this can be a situation where there may not be state or federal monies or permits that are involved in a project that a town will undertake. So, for example, you know, DPW work, work by the Parks Department. There are all sorts of projects that towns undertake that don't require sort of permitting and officially need to have consultation with Mass Historical Commission. So if towns have these local review mechanisms in place where a town-sponsored project runs through the Historical Commission, or there's some type of oversight or review process in place, that can avoid coming across archaeological sites during construction. That is always, in every situation, the most costly way to do archaeological investigation. So you're in the middle of a project, everything comes to a screeching halt, you have contractors who are unable to work. That consultation process that I mentioned can take a while, just begins in the middle. So my best advice is just, if you're a local community member, if you're a historical commission member, to be thinking about and to start putting together some sort of a plan for local review of projects.
That's great advice. I think another thing we're talking about is it's so oftentimes preservation, you know, in and of its nature, it does tend to be reactive, but we've talked a lot, you know, the PM has talked about it, Chris Kelly has talked about it, about, you know, how can we be a little more proactive and encouraging communities to do things like survey and to really try to set up good, you know, a good process and make those connections and build relationships with other, you know, your local select board, other agencies, commissions. So when something does happen, you already have a seat at the table. But I think that's really good advice to set up some sort of local review process, so you don't have to, you know, you don't end up in that situation. So I guess I did get the gist of Diane Gilbert's question. So yay. Here's one from Chris Kelly, which I kind of think is really interesting. Is just went down. Where Chris's go? Since PAL does a lot of work around the Northeast and around the country, are there some programs that you've seen in other states, like in the Northeast or around the country, that you'd like to see, you know, that you'd like to see in Mass?
That is an interesting question. I would just add that, I'll be real quick. I would just add that the the regional commissions, so the Cape Cod Commission and the Martha's Vineyard Commission, we work with them on a number of projects. They can be really effective ways to bring resources from multiple communities together. And I'm not sure if there are other similar regional organizations in other parts of Mass, but they have those in some of the other states. And I think that's something that certainly people could consider. And I would like to see more of that if possible in Massachusetts.
And I would say, actually speaking as a consultant and not as a program for people using consultants, is that in some of the states we work with, they have workshops for consultants, sort of annual or every 2 years, just to have a conversation and to update, keep everyone up to date on legislation, review processes, and for example, the Pennsylvania SHPO, any notifications they get from the Park Service about survey planning and our historic tax credits, they'll share it as they get it. It can even be weekly. So I think having good communication between the SHPO office and consultants is helpful. I'm not sure about, Mass Historical has so many great programs. I think they're sort of the model for a lot of the other SHPO offices in the region. But if I think of any, I'll let you know.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Maureen. And yay, Massachusetts as a model. That's always great. I know as in our work as a statewide, PM does a lot of work, and we always look a lot of work in connecting with our North New England partners, and we like to share ideas back and forth and copy ideas. I know I think the Preservation Connecticut has actually started doing a similar thing to these preservation conversations, which is great. They were inspired by what we were doing, so that's wonderful. And Susan Taylor is giving a shout out to Holly and the team at POW for their wonderful work in North Attleboro. So, yay!
Oh, thank you.
And one last question. I know we have a couple others, Diane and Otis, I'll follow up with you afterwards via email for your question about the interpretation on the Knox Trail. So this is from Emma at MAPC, and she's interested in the work you've done with the Wampanoag tribe of Gay Head. Are there any resources you would recommend in terms of best practices for consulting with Native American communities? And can you talk about any interpretive work or educational program you've done around Native American history in Massachusetts and or the Northeast?
Sure, I can talk about that. We work very, very closely with all of the New England tribes. So the Wampanoag tribe of Gay Head Aquina, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, the Nipmuc tribe. Those are Massachusetts groups, but also we have really strong connections with Native American communities in all of the states we work in. And I'll just say that we have been involved in a number of historical and interpretive projects, but we really typically try to allow the majority of that information to be generated by the tribes, for them to identify the historical information that they want to share and to have them do their own interpretation. So while we work really closely, especially on archaeological projects, we come at it from two different perspectives. And as a consultant, we definitely don't want to be speaking on behalf of or for the tribes. So in terms of best practices for consultation and projects, I encourage everyone to reach out directly to the tribal historic preservation offices for the tribes in the areas where you live or do your work. They're all very approachable. They are full-time employees who have access to all sorts of tribal resources. And there are a number of sort of best practices documents that are out there. The Army Corps of Engineers has a couple that you can get online. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, I would encourage you to go to their website. They have documents that you can download that are free, that involve Native American coordination and consultation. But in general, I think that outreach and inclusion of Indigenous groups in any type of project or planning that you do is a fantastic thing, and I say reach out directly.
Thank you, Holly. That's hugely helpful advice. And I know Preservation Mass, we don't have, we had reached out to the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead when we were putting our statewide conference together in Plymouth last year. And we have had some connection with the Mashpee Wampanoag, Wampanoag tribe. They do have a TIPO there, but I think you're right, reaching out and inclusion and connecting with them early on is very important. And I think that's something that, PM as a statewide, we should, something that we would like to be able to do and probably need to do a bit better job of as well. And when we were in Washington, D.C., we never, in addition to asking for increases to the Historic Preservation Fund, which helps fund our SHPO's offices, they also help fund the TIPO's, the Tribal Historic Preservation offices as well. So.
Yeah, and I would just quickly add that they're really strapped for people and resources. So while they're very responsive, you need to give them plenty of time because they have a lot to do and very little resources available. So that's my last word on that.
Yes, wonderful. Well, Holly and Maureen, thank you so much for letting us all learn more about what you do at POW, your role as preservation consultants and archaeological consultants for our communities. I think it's been one of my favorite preservation conversations we've had. And thank you so much for giving of your time and your expertise and answering our questions. This has been fantastic. So again, huge shout out to POW and Maureen and Holly for all they do and how they've, been helping preservation in Massachusetts for many years. So, and to you all who are on, thank you for attending. And as we said at the top of the hour, if you have any thoughts or suggestions, feel free to email either myself or Chris Skelly if you have any ideas for future conversations or workshops that you would like to see. Either virtually or out in the community when we're all able to gather again, which is slowly starting to happen, thankfully. My email's here, Chris Kelly's email's here. Feel free. And next week, we have our last preservation conversation for Preservation Month. It is another installment of Who Are They and Why Do I Need Them? And we'll be speaking with 3 preservation architects. Also members of the Preservation Mass Board of Directors, because I asked them. Scott Winkler from Westland Associates, Bob Score, the former Director of Preservation for Consigli Construction, and Wendell Calso from McGinley Calso Associates. So probably another great conversation, and we'll see lots of really cool projects. And June 3rd, we're going to talk about money. We're going to have a conversation about preservation grants, which is going to feature Mass Historic Commission grant staff, which will be very, very helpful. So thank you so much all for attending. This will be up on YouTube and the PM website later on today. If we didn't answer your question, we'll follow up with you and make sure we get your questions answered the best we can. And thank you all for attending, and we hope everybody has a great Wednesday, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Erin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Erin, anyone is welcome to call Holly or me.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so very much, Maureen.
Or email, either one.
Yeah, call or email. Yeah, we're happy to take your calls.
You guys are great. Thank you
Bye.
so very much. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.